The smell hit them first. Not the gunfire. Not the screams. The smell. It rolled across the German countryside like an invisible wave of death, so thick that battle-hardened soldiers, men who had seen their friends blown apart, men who had slept in trenches filled with corpses, doubled over and vomited into the spring grass. April 4, 1945. The war was almost over. The trees were blooming. Birds were singing. And somewhere beyond those pretty German hills, hell had opened its gates. General George S. Patton sat in his command car, his jaw clenched. He was a man who loved war the way other men loved wine. He wore ivory-handled pistols. He believed in reincarnation and past battles. He had sent thousands to their deaths without losing a night's sleep. But when he stepped out of that car, even Patton wasn't ready for what came next. "General," the young officer stammered, his face drained of color. "You need to see this. I don't have words for it." Patton followed. And what he saw behind those barbed wire gates would break something inside him that could never be fixed. Welcome to Ohrdruf. The first Nazi concentration camp liberated by American forces. The place where a general became a prosecutor, where a town's lies died in a single afternoon, and where two people chose death over living with the truth. The soldiers of the 4th Armored Division had rolled up expecting maybe a prisoner of war camp. Maybe some hungry soldiers. Maybe some paperwork and a few handshakes. Instead, they found walking skeletons. Men in striped rags, weighing 60 pounds, their eyes huge and hollow and faces that looked like skulls wrapped in parchment. They didn't cheer when the Americans arrived. They couldn't. They were too weak to make sound. They just reached out with bone-thin fingers and touched the white stars painted on the tanks, tears streaming down their faces. Touching the metal again and again to make sure it was real. That they were real. That salvation had finally come. Patton walked through the gates flanked by Generals Omar Bradley and Dwight Eisenhower, three of the most powerful men in the Allied forces. They had commanded armies. They had planned invasions. They thought they had seen everything war could offer. They were wrong. The first thing they saw was the bodies. Not one. Not 10. Dozens. Stacked like firewood in neat rows. Naked. Starved to nothing but bone and skin. Shot in the back of the head. The SS guards had fled just hours before, but before they ran, they tried to erase the evidence. They machine-gunned anyone too sick to walk. They piled them in sheds. They poured quicklime over the flesh to dissolve it faster. But they ran out of time. Patton approached one of the piles. His riding crop trembled in his hand. Then a survivor crawled toward him. A man so thin his bones jutted through his skin like broken piano keys. He tried to kiss Patton's boots. Patton stepped back gently, then reached down and helped the man stand. There were tears in the general's eyes. They moved deeper into the camp. They found the torture shed. Inside was a wooden whipping block, stained almost black with old blood. Hooks hung from the ceiling where prisoners were strung up by their wrists until their shoulders dislocated. A prisoner who spoke English, acting as their guide, explained in a flat, dead voice how guards would beat men to death for entertainment. Eisenhower turned white. His face became a mask. Bradley couldn't speak. He just stared. But Patton was shaking with rage. He walked to the back of the shed. His aides saw his shoulders heave. When he came back, his face was wet. The toughest general in the United States Army, the man who called himself Old Blood and Guts, had just vomited behind a building. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Cold. Precise. Lethal. Did the people in that town know about this? A young military policeman shifted uncomfortably. They say they didn't, sir. They say they thought it was just a prison for criminals. Patton laughed. It was a terrible sound, bitter and sharp as broken glass. They didn't know? He pointed toward the town of Ohrdruf, just 2 miles away. Pretty houses. Flower boxes. Clean streets. The smell alone covers the entire valley. They knew. And then Patton gave an order that would echo through history. Go into that town. Find the mayor. Find his wife. Find every banker, every doctor, every respected citizen. Patton's voice was ice. And bring them here. Bring them all here. Sir. What if they refuse? Patton's hand moved to the ivory handle of his pistol. They won't refuse. Use trucks. Use bayonets if necessary. But every single one of them will tour this camp. Today. It wasn't in any military manual. It wasn't standard procedure. It was pure, calculated justice. Forced witnessing. Patton was going to destroy their denial. He was going to take their comfortable lies and burn them to ash. The next morning, trucks pulled up to the camp gates. Out stepped the citizens of Ohrdruf. They wore their Sunday best, men in pressed suits and ties, women in dresses and coats, some with pearls around their necks. They looked annoyed. Inconvenienced. Some held handkerchiefs to their noses, complaining about the smell. They still carried themselves with arrogance. They were Germans. The master race. Why were they being dragged to this filthy place? Patton stood waiting, arms crossed, eyes like flint. March them through, he ordered the MPs, don't let them look away. If anyone closes their eyes, use your rifle butt. Make them see. The tour began. The civilians were led to the first pile of corpses. The chattering stopped. The complaints died. There was only the sound of flies buzzing and the wind moving through the trees. They stared at bodies that looked like they were made of sticks and paper. At faces frozen in agony. At the evidence of systematic murder. One woman fainted. The soldiers caught her and propped her back up. Keep moving, the MPs barked. They were shown the whipping block. The hooks. The ovens where bodies were burned. They were forced to look into the open, dead eyes of the victims. And slowly, the transformation happened. First came shock. Mouths hanging open. Hands trembling. Then horror. Women screaming. Men turning away only to be shoved back by rifle barrels. Then something else. Guilt. You could see it spreading across their faces like a stain. Some of the men started weeping. Some of the women became hysterical. But others just stared at their shoes, unable to meet anyone's eyes. They had known. Maybe they hadn't known the details. Maybe they hadn't seen the bodies. But they had known something terrible was happening behind those fences. They had smelled it. They had seen the trains. They had heard the screams carried on the wind. They had simply chosen not to. Look. Patton walked up to the mayor. The man was trembling, tears streaming down his face. You knew, didn't you? The mayor couldn't answer. He just shook his head, sobbing. Patton turned to his staff, his voice carrying across the camp. You see? They're not the master race. They're just people who sold their souls and now they can't buy them back. The tour lasted 2 hours. By the end, the citizens of Ohrdruf were broken. Their arrogance had evaporated like morning mist. The smell of death clung to their clothes, would cling to their memories forever. They climbed back into the trucks in silence, their eyes hollow, their faces gray. They returned to their clean houses with the flower boxes. But they would never be clean again. Patton wrote to his wife that night. I have never felt such rage, but I believe we taught them a lesson they will never forget. But for some, the lesson was too much to bear. The next morning, American soldiers went to the mayor's house with new orders. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Finally, they kicked the door open. Inside, they found the mayor and his wife dead. They had slit their own wrists. Blood pooled on the clean wooden floor of their clean German home. Beside them was a note, written in shaking handwriting. We cannot live with this shame. When Patton heard the news, he showed no pity. He nodded once, grimly. That's 2 fewer Nazis we have to feed. It sounds cruel. But Patton had seen the bodies of the innocent. He had looked into the eyes of the survivors. He had no tears left for the guilty. The liberation of Ohrdruf changed everything. Eisenhower, usually calm and measured, became a crusader. He realized immediately that people would deny this had happened. Future generations would call it propaganda, exaggeration, lies. So he issued an order: bring cameras. Bring reporters. Photograph everything. Film everything. He said something that would prove prophetic: get it all on record now, because someday some son of a bitch will say this never happened. He ordered thousands of American soldiers to tour the camp. He wanted them to understand what they were fighting for. Why their friends had died. Before Ohrdruf, many soldiers thought the war was about territory and politics. After Ohrdruf, they knew it was about good versus evil. One young soldier wrote in his diary, "I will never feel sorry for a German again. Now I know what we're fighting for. We're fighting monsters." General Patton is remembered for his tanks, his ivory pistols, his speeches about blood and guts. But on that spring day in 1945, he wasn't a general. He was a human being confronted with absolute evil. And his response wasn't to look away. It was to grab that evil by the throat and force the world to see it. The mayor of Ohrdruf couldn't live with what he saw. But because of Patton, because of Eisenhower, because of those cameras and those witnesses, the world will never be able to forget. Eisenhower was right. Today, there are still people who deny these things happened. Who call the evidence fake. Who say the numbers are exaggerated. This is why we remember. This is why we tell these stories. This is why the truth must be preserved, documented, and shared. Not to spread hate, but to prevent it from happening again. Because the moment we forget what humans are capable of doing to each other is the moment we become capable of doing it again. The smell that hit those soldiers on April 4, 1945, was the smell of evil. And we must never let ourselves forget what evil smells like.